No?
No.
Mary, you can continue. Můžeš ještě hrát, jestli chceš, chvilku, než se posadí všichni.
No, he's just being polite.
If you wanted to share, I can do it.
Thank you so much, David. You're amazing.
Já jsem vás přesunula na druhou stranu, jo? We are running, so you can...
Sorry.
You're kicking me out and I'm making an accident.
Here we can start.
Hi guys, we're gonna start. It's kind of like about time, so thank you for joining us. We're finally doing this together. We decided to bring the people that is interested the most into international law and politics, so you were selected for that, the chosen ones. So we brought a host today that can explain better this topic than I do in our Humanities program. So if you have any questions about the presentation and the information that is going to be provided to you today, please take notes and feel free to ask anything and as much as you want. That will make it more interesting and more productive if you do. All right, so I'll leave you with your host, Daniel.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm from Hungary. I graduated in Budapest in 2016 in international relations. I spent a semester in Prague as an exchange student. And I heard you like war crimes, so here we are. I see much more people than I expected, but that's okay. I hope you're awake. I hope I'm awake. So let's start. So, I'm going to talk about these things for about 45 minutes. Then we can take a break and then we will have time for your questions in the second half, if that's okay. If you have any questions to clarify while I'm going through the slides, please wait until I finish the slide, and then if you have questions related to the slides, I can answer that quickly. So, first of all, international law is different a bit than domestic laws because it's much more difficult to get all countries to agree on the same thing. There are 4 sources of international law. International treaties, those are agreements between countries. This is a primary source of law. The 2 in the middle, general principles of law and decisions of national and lower court scholarly writings. These are secondary sources of law. That means that international treaties and international customs take precedence over these. However, general principles and decisions of courts are taken into account when making laws and interpreting laws. International custom is a very interesting thing. Basically, to simplify it, it's countries to say, we've always done this in the same way, therefore you have to do it that way. If you derogate from that, then you're not respecting the law. For example, you're not supposed to run red lights, but if you run a red light and you never get punished for it and you keep running red lights, eventually that will become the custom and it will become lawful just by you doing it. You see that paragraph symbol there? If you flip it upside down, it will be the same paragraph symbol. So international law and international customs can be interpreted in a lot of ways, which creates a lot of complications in the relations of countries and when applying these laws. Now, international humanitarian law is a subsection of international law. There is a big distinction between right in war and right to war. So right in war is international humanitarian law that deals with how wars are conducted. The right to war, it deals with why wars are conducted. This is more of a political issue. The right to war is not covered in international humanitarian law. I just wanted to mention it to clarify. So we're not going to talk more about that today. The goal of international law is to limit damage caused by war on people and property. This is the main objective, so everything that is codified in international humanitarian law has this objective in mind, and it has to be interpreted this way. There are four main principles. Humanity. Are the actions undertaken respecting human life, human dignity, human property? Are they necessary? Do the costs outweigh the benefits or not? Distinction is distinction between military targets and civilians or protected persons. Proportionality is the military action undertaken in proportion with the goal, the military goal that is to be achieved. So, for example, nuking one bunker is not proportional, right? Military necessity is considered as in the actions undertaken, are they contributing to the strategic or tactical objective or not? There are two sets of laws, international humanitarian law and human rights law. Important distinction, I'm just going to mention in human rights law. We're not going deeper into that right now, so we're sticking to international humanitarian law. But it's important that you see this as well, because when we're talking about specific cases, it will be important to understand these differences. So, international humanitarian law applies only during armed conflicts. It's only applicable once the hostilities begin and only until the hostilities end. Whereas human rights law always applies and is mainly tailored for peacetime. International humanitarian law permits no derogation. That means that whatever is codified in those laws always have to be adhered to. Whereas human rights law may permit derogations under certain conditions. For example, state emergencies, as we've seen during COVID. Humanitarian law protects those who are not taking part in hostilities. These are the wounded and sick prisoners of war. We will go into that later. You could argue that it protects those who are taking part in hostilities as well, because of the weapons convention. Certain weapons are banned and such things. But here you have to understand protect in a legal sense. Whereas human rights law protects everyone, and its main objective is to protect civilians from their own governments. Humanitarian law is monitored by the International Committee of the Red Cross and adjudicated by the International Criminal Court since 2001, since it was established. Before that, international tribunals were convened in an ad hoc manner to find facts and persecute those guilty in specific wars. Under international humanitarian law, it is possible to commit war crimes. You cannot commit war crimes in peacetime. Whereas human rights law is monitored by a much larger variety of courts and treaty bodies, and crimes against humanity and crimes of aggression fall under human rights law. So, for example, the Holocaust itself would have been a crime against humanity and would have been persecuted under human rights law. It's not in itself a war crime as such. The main sources of international humanitarian law are the Geneva Law and the Hague Law. I just put those there. I'm not going to go into much detail about them right now because I don't think it's really necessary. The Geneva Law, it basically regulates issues of protection in armed conflicts of people who are not taking part in the hostilities. The Hague Law regulates how those conflicts are fought, what weapons may be used, how to distinguish when it is lawful to engage or not engage. Some additional sources are these. These are mostly weapon conventions and environmental modification convention, for example, to prevent long-lasting damage to people and to the environment. I'm going to give you a few definitions which I think are necessary for you to understand later when we are going to talk about your questions. You can refer to these because probably questions that you have will be answered by this already. So first, what is war? The declaration of war is a formal act by one state announcing that war activity will take place. This was required under the Hague Law, but customs have taken precedence because a lot of countries just went to war without declaring war. So it's a bit of an outdated concept, so to say, to declare war today. It's related to an old German word which means to confuse, to perplex, to bring into confusion, which I just found interesting, so I put it in there. So, and war is not a legal term. The Committee of the Red Cross uses these two terms to refer to war: international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict. International armed conflict always takes place between two or more states, that is by international. Whereas non-international armed conflicts take place between either one state and organized armed groups, or multiple organized armed groups who are not states. However, non-international armed conflicts, the non-international component of this does not refer to territory. It just means that it is not between states. There are a few criteria for an armed conflict to be considered non-international armed conflict, as in legally war. It has to be protracted, intense. That means that the armed forces must be involved, so military, not police. They have to be widespread, so most of the territory of the country must be in a conflict zone. And the groups that are fighting have to be organized. They have to have a command structure. That means people responsible for their subordinates. And these are the criteria that distinguish a non-international armed conflict, say a civil war, from a simple riot, for example. Because if you have a riot in one city and the police puts it down, say brutally, they shoot into the crowd, for example, that would not constitute a war crime, because the intensity of the conflict is not to the level to justify invoking international humanitarian law. Two types of combatants. Privileged combatants, you might know this as lawful combatants, but that is also not a legal term, so it's privileged. That means they are entitled to a prisoner of war status. They cannot be held responsible for violations of civilian laws, so this gives them the right to kill, for example. But they can be targeted anytime by the enemy. Privileged combatants can be from three categories: members of the armed forces, that means military, air force, navy, so on. Police is not an armed force unless they are legally merged with the army, so policemen are not privileged combatants, even though they carry weapons, for example. Militias, volunteer corps, and resistance movements are privileged combatants if they fulfill the criteria there. And levée en masse is a French term. It goes back to the French Revolution. Masse levée in English. This is a spontaneously organized group of people who take up arms upon the approach of enemy forces. They do not have to fill all four criteria, but they do have to carry arms openly, and they have to participate in conflict in accordance with international humanitarian law. Now, they don't have to be commanded by a person responsible because it's a spontaneous organization, so that would kind of defeat the purpose. Unprivileged combatant, this is what you would call unlawful combatant. In some national legislations, such as the USA, they, for example, distinguish between lawful and unlawful combatants. That was the basis for the Guantanamo tortures and trials, for example. They are not entitled to prisoner of war status, but they can still be targeted by the enemy. Of course, they take part in hostilities as well. However, for an unprivileged combatant to become unprivileged, they have to be, their actions have to be deliberated and considered by a competent court in a fair trial by the captor. And only then do they lose privileges, meaning losing prisoner of war status. And then they can be tried under the civilian laws of the detaining power for terrorism or other charges that's up to the detainer. So, unprivileged combatants are the combatants who breach the laws and customs of war or fail to distinguish themselves from civilians. Distinguishing themselves from civilians is very important, because if they do not distinguish themselves, that first of all defeats one of the main principles of international humanitarian law, which is distinction, and ultimately that contributes or even makes impossible the whole objective why international humanitarian law exists in the first place, because the enemy will not be able to implement the principles aimed at protecting civilians. Spies are unprivileged combatants, and reconnaissance and special operations units are considered spies only if they do not wear their uniform behind enemy lines. So if they parachute in wearing only black, they can be punished under civilian laws. If they wear uniforms, they are prisoners of war entitled to certain protections. Mercenaries, child soldiers, and civilians who directly participate in hostilities count as unprivileged combatants. However, child soldiers and civilians, as soon as they put down a weapon, they will be still considered civilians. That's why they cannot be prisoners of war, which actually gives them more protections in certain cases. However, mercenaries will never be considered civilians. So, what's a prisoner of war? If a combatant is captured by the enemy, most likely they will be detained by the enemy to prevent them from participation in hostilities. However, they cannot be detained to punish them. So, for example, an enemy combatant cannot be tried just because he was taking part in hostilities. He has to have broken specific laws set out by the international humanitarian law. The prisoners of war have the right to humane treatment there is a very, very, very long description on what certain conditions have to be fulfilled for them to be considered treated humanly. Death, serious endangerment, all these things are forbidden. I found it interesting that prisoners of war have to be allowed to access and consume tobacco. Apparently, if you deny a cigarette to a prisoner of war, you do not treat them humanely. Yeah, and also in some cases, not only combatants can be prisoners of war, as you can see down here. So, civilian has two definitions based on which conflict they find themselves in. In an international armed conflict, any person who does not belong to the armed forces of a state and does not take part in a levée en masse is considered civilian. And in a non-international armed conflict, all persons who are neither members of a state or armed forces. Sorry, have to wake up still. So yeah, a civilian is basically someone who does not fight on either side actively. I guess a lot of you have heard about the case in Ukraine where a civilian was shot for holding a cell phone in his hand, and then the soldier who shot him has been sentenced to life. Now again, he was neither a member of a state armed force nor a member of an organized armed group. However, as you could see at unprivileged combatants, civilians who directly participate in hostilities are considered combatants. Now, I don't know if a cell phone is a weapon, but it can certainly kill people. And yeah, in case of doubt, any person has to be treated as a civilian first until a court decides that they are not in captivity. Who are the protected persons? All these here, they have similar rights to prisoner of war status, but they have additional protections. For example, deportation, forced labor, destruction of property are forbidden, whereas prisoners of war might be employed to work, for example. Women and children have additional rights. That goes for prisoners of war as well. Reading? Not reading? Done?
Just what are the additional laws for women and children?
So, women have to have separate bathrooms, for example, or attacks on the dignity of women, such as rape or forced pregnancy, are forbidden. Children cannot be made to work, or they have to have more space, more food, and they have to have access to education. Yeah, it is a very long document. So yeah.
So men are allowed to rape each other. Seems weird that only women have a problem.
Consent is the key, Marek, right?
However, they will still be tried under civilian laws. So if the civilian law forbids child rape, then no. So, occupation is unconsented to effective control over a territory which is outside of the sovereign title of a given state. As soon as the enemy has effective control and placed under the and the authority over the territory, it is considered occupied. And there should be more of these. Interesting. So these are the war crimes as listed in the founding treaty that created the International Court of Justice. So basically these are the definition of war crimes.
Whoa. I think when the transported the file just split a slide.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my fault.
Can you read it? Do you see it?
No.
No. Okay.
Maybe you can copy the rest
Yeah,
to
create a
the
new slide. Plus. Where's the plus? In the corner? Go to the next one. There you go.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On the previous slide, the first point was willful killing. What does that mean exactly? Because if I'm a soldier and I'm probably like willfully killing someone.
Is it necessary? Is it proportional? Is it humane? Is it distinct? Are you killing a combatant or a civilian? Is it really necessary to kill them? Can you incapacitate them instead?
Don't you have like individual rights as a soldier for killing people, or in a war maybe?
If you kill lawfully, then you're protected, as you could see on the privileged combatant slide. You're exempt from some civilian laws, however, you cannot kill just anyone. Yeah.
Can I ask, for example, politicians, for example, a prime minister that is at war,
Yeah.
if he gets killed, or if he gets killed, is it considered okay, or is it considered killing a civilian?
That probably would depend on which country, because in a lot of cases the president is also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Parliamentaries are protected people, so usually the president wouldn't be taking up a gun and shooting himself. So that would probably be a war crime. Especially if the president is captured by the enemy, they have to put him on trial. If the trial finds him guilty, a fair trial finds him guilty, then execution might be on the table.
I was just wondering, how do you determine if a trial is fair?
It has to adhere to the laws and principles of whichever country is conducting the trial according to their laws and protocols.
So let's say I was a dictator and my country would be pretty under my rule, and I would, let's say, take this president and say just, okay, he's guilty, let's just kill him. Would that be considered a fair trial?
Not under human rights law, which always applies.
Okay.
Don't do this to Poland, Kaiko. Please.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I should have added human rights as codified by the United Nations Charter still apply. So, yeah. Also, just a fun fact, so to say. These sources of humanitarian law are universally accepted throughout the world. It's ratified by 196 countries, which is not all of them, however.
Who are those that are not?
Since these have already entered customary law, they are considered binding on states that have not signed them. Which was, for example, the basis of the Nuremberg trials, because Germany was not a signatory at that time to the Geneva Conventions, or not all of them. However, the Allies decided that these laws have been already in practice and accepted by so many countries that it will regardless be binding on Germany too. However, the United States, for example, was not a signatory to the Geneva Protocols of 1914, not conventions, protocols, on certain banned weapons. And that was what they were arguing in their war against Vietnam when they used Agent Orange to defoliate the jungle. That since they were not signatories, they were not forbidden from using Agent Orange. But they used it 40 years after that protocol was signed. So, in Nuremberg trials, these laws applied to Germany, but after the Vietnam War, they do not apply to the US because
it's the US.
because
Just what is the difference between protocol and the second one?
Convention?
Protocol is a more specific, smaller scope agreement. A convention is usually an agreement between multiple states, many states, and they are trying to solve a sort of universal issue that can be present around the entire world, and it can contain multiple treaties. So basically a convention is larger in scope than a protocol or a treaty. Yeah. And I think the war crimes were the last slide, so that went faster than I thought.
Chcete přestávku? Jo?
Alrighty, guys. Let's take a seat then. I hope you took the time to discuss with the person next to you. I hope you were discussing about the topic and creating some questions. So we can start the round of questions, and if you want examples of anything, go ahead. Yeah.
We can also go back to the beginning and go through the slides again. Now that you heard it once, maybe some more details if you're interested.
Yeah, hi. I was just interested in the definition of poison the weapons in the other war crimes. I'm not sure what to quite imagine under poison the weapons.
I mean, that could be a poison dagger, even poison canister, artillery shell.
Maybe bullets,
Oh, yeah.
like some kind of modified bullets.
If you manage to do that, yeah.
How about contaminating water?
That would be the environmental modification.
Mm.
However, Nigeria raised exactly that question when that treaty was signed. They said that poisoning a well does not constitute environmental modification because it's not long-lasting and it's not on a large scale, which is kind of true. You can uncontaminate one well, right?
Right.
But
you poison a village, for example, or you get them sick and neutralize the town like that.
there is no distinction there.
No?
They do not distinguish between civilians and combatants in that case.
Okay. Singer, you had another question, then Matthew, yeah?
Yes, I have a question about, I'm not sure if you mentioned it about, for example, freedom fighters. So if there's an occupying force,
Yeah.
let's say there was a war, somebody occupied a region, and after a peace treaty, that region is given to the occupying force. Now there are freedom fighters in that region that don't want to be under occupation, and they start doing attacks against, not really against civilians, but against armed forces that are there to keep peace. Would they be considered like war crimes against those people if they're not at war? And
You mean would the freedom fighters
yeah, would the freedom
be
fighters
considered?
could they be like tried at an international court because of it, or should they just be punished by the state itself if they're ever caught?
Well, that would probably fall under the War of National Liberation, which fights against colonial domination or alien occupation.
But what if it's agreed by the UN that that region now goes to that country?
But people have the right to self-determination.
So they have the rights to terrorize the occupying force even if they are, let's say, acknowledged by the UN.
They would, however, they should hold a referendum first. It has not been very common since the Second World War for any state to lose or gain much territory as an award for winning or as a punishment for losing. But under the right of self-determination, those people have to be asked where they want to be. Likely the new state that they are under the control of would not allow that vote. Or if you see Scotland or Catalonia, it's very difficult to get the central government to hold a referendum about losing territory and people. But if the violence goes to the necessary intensity and it takes long enough, then they are considered an armed group. So then it would be a non-international armed conflict. Whether they commit war crimes or not is up to them. This question actually would relate more to right to war, which is why wars happen and not how they happen.
Satisfied with the answer?
Yeah, I have some more questions.
Alright. Just
Go
raise your
ahead.
hands anytime. If you have more questions, go ahead, then Matthew is going to make his question.
Okay, well, I had like a short one. I was thinking really about, for example, partisans during the Second World War. If they committed some acts against civilians, do you think they should have been trialed at the Nuremberg trial with Nazis because they did commit war crimes if they ever like targeted civilians that are innocent?
Yeah.
Do you think they should have been, if that ever happened, do you think they should have been trialed in Nuremberg with Nazis?
Yes.
Okay. That was my question.
Matthew?
Okay.
Does forced pregnancy law applies to men too?
I don't think they really thought about that back in 1949, so...
What was the question?
Forced pregnancy, does this apply to men as well?
However, these I copied directly from the Rome Protocols. So, where is it? It does not specify, so I guess yes.
Well, I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, what is like the thing that keeps... What is like the punishment for breaking a war crime? Is it force from the United Nations?
It is up to the International Criminal Court to decide.
But like the final answer to a war crime is waging war against a war crime. The person who caused the war crime, right? If I understand correctly.
Sorry, the last sentence, could you repeat?
If I understand it correctly.
The one before that?
Well, damn, now I forgot about it. Wait, so basically, if someone does a war crime, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's a big one, does the United Nations wage war against them?
The United Nations doesn't have the authority to.
Well, it can call for war against
make a
them.
sentence applicable.
The UN doesn't have a force.
Yeah, but it can call for a conflict, like, right? Someone can come up to the United Nations and call for a conflict against them, and then the United Armies strike against them.
I mean,
no?
The UN cannot call to war.
And the blue helmets are peacemakers. They're not going to go to reinforce an international court, sentence execution to execute the punishment.
However, it is the duty of every country to look for and detain war criminals. If it has been decided that they have committed war crimes, then every country has the duty to find them and detain them.
Okay.
Or find a way to get the penalty going. Like, I give you an example in Nicaragua when we had the Contra war in the 80s. Nicaragua brought the USA to the Hague, right? And it was determined that the CIA head and the government of the United States participated in the civil war that happened in Nicaragua. They got sentenced, and the court decided that there should be a reparation amount of money because they were found guilty. And it's up to this day, there has been no way to make the government of the United States pay the money. So who reinforces that? It also shows diplomatic willingness of the country to execute a sentence of the court. So it'll be the same. There is ability, there's no willingness. So it's the same, like if they have to, I think it happened also with what happened with Pinochet, with the dictator Pinochet in Chile. They opened a court to sentence all of their generals that participated in the massacres with Pinochet, right? And they, after 70 years, some generals were found guilty after they were already dead, or they were very old. And it was up to the country, the willingness of the court to actually bring these guys to prison or the punishment. And some of them were in other countries and they needed to be extradited and things like that. But then other countries would not give it to Chile so they can go to jail. They were protected in some other countries. So it's always diplomatic willingness for these things to be executed.
So if I understand correctly, then the only way to punish a war crime is if the country who did the war crime after some time agrees with the punishment.
Not really.
Not necessarily. There's a lot of things that have to collide for these things.
Plus, there is always someone responsible, a person. That's why it's important to have an organized command structure with superiors who are responsible for the actions of the subordinates. So it's usually not really a country that is punished, it's someone who ordered that specific thing to happen.
Okay, but let's say, theoretically, that we have a country, a massive country, we have a large military force, who just completely who signed or declared themselves part of the law in the past, but now they have, like, let's say a dictator who's just said that it's like all bullshit, and he just starts just ignoring the right to war. There you go, that's the word. And so what does the United Nations do about that?
Depends on what they can do.
Yeah, if he just completely ignores everything and just starts bombing civilians.
It's diplomatic pressure. The United States has diplomatic pressure. All the countries are participating. It's a platform for discussion, right? So they create resolutions to create like, this is the planet's opinion. We're giving you a piece of advice, this country, you should do this or that. But that's where it ends. Like, it's always willingness of the state. Singer, you wanted to say something.
I had a question if you're not finished with that in London.
No, that's
okay. I have two questions for you. Can the United Nations, does it have the right to call for big organizations like NATO to put a peacekeeping force or to put a armed force in a armed conflict? For example, let's say there's a war between two countries and both countries do like, or one country does war crimes against the other country, committing genocide.
Mm-hmm.
Does the UN have the right to call upon, let's say, NATO to put their forces in the country? To end the conflict?
So the host country, the host to the conflict, they do have the right to ask for assistance. They can do it with the United Nations. They can also do it bilaterally with any country they want. And if that country accepts to help, then that would be a lawful war, so to say. So that would not count as unjustified or criminal aggression. The UN can decide, yes, that a country should get help, but it's always like an organization such as NATO cannot force a member country to go to war. NATO would be a defensive alliance. So if any NATO country gets attacked, all NATO joins in a defensive war. But if it's an offensive operation, then it's up to each country to decide whether they want to join in or not. So the UN cannot force really any country, but they can ask.
Wasn't that what happened in Kosovo?
That would be an example, although Serbia did not seem to agree much. But yeah. Yeah.
Do you think the UN should have an armed force?
Oh, that's a very complex question.
Because like now, from what I understand, they have like the blue helmets that are like a peacekeeping force, but they do not like engage in the war. They're just like in the territories to make sure there is no war in those territories.
Yeah, it's more like armed humanitarian workers, but that would raise a lot of issues with sovereignty of all the countries in the planet. If the UN has a military force that can conduct offensive operations, who controls that force really? Because, for example, if there is a UN vote, should the UN army intervene in this country? How many votes do you need to authorize that action?
Half. More than half, though.
More than half? So, is that really enough? And why would what would be the justification for such an intervention? Because especially now, with all the misinformation and media wars and fake news, do you really know what's going on in Uganda right now, for example? No, you have no idea. You can see pictures, you can see deep fakes of the president talking. It's really difficult to determine the actual facts. So I would say that I personally don't think it's a good idea for the UN to have a standing force. This is the same issue with the European defense forces that the French have been trying to establish for years. If the EU has a military force, that erodes the country's sovereignty within it. So
I would say it's a bit of a different issue with the EU and the UN force.
But besides that, remember that the United Nations have the Security Council with the 5 permanent members that have a veto power. So that means that they were always going to veto any intervention that has to take place in one of their territories. So the rest of 190 something members can be intervened except the ones with the veto privilege. It's a little bit tricky for countries to accept the existence of a UN army like that. So.
Yeah.
Just a question about the war crimes. How were they punished in the history, like after the World War II? How were they punished, for example, in Germany?
Executions. Imprisonment. I mean, a lot of a lot of people were just simply let go, so to say. But yeah, I don't think paying a fine from your personal finances would really do much. But with Nazi Germany, it was so very difficult because it was also crimes against humanity committed, and the harshest punishments were probably given to the people who were participating in the Holocaust, which was a crime against humanity, not a war crime as such. So yeah, I really cannot give you any specific examples or names. I have not looked into that when I was making this presentation. But yeah, like basically the objective was to punish the top, so to say, because if the tribunal had decided to punish everybody who was taking part, then Germany, like, it's not viable, it's not practical to do. So they conducted the denazification process instead in the 50s.
About executions, can today the Hague Accord sentence somebody to death?
Depends on the country.
I mean,
Depends on country.
United States captured, for example, was it Saddam Hussein?
Yeah.
And the United States hanged them in their own territory under their own law.
But
it was not even taken in international court even.
Yeah, but I mean the United States is not really. They have a lot of problems with the International Criminal Court, as do a lot of countries. So it is probably depending on the domestic law of the perpetrator and also the captor. However, Saddam was hanged during the armed conflict, not after, right? So
yeah. I don't think there was even a trial for that guy.
Okay, so then usually they just go to jail.
Pardon?
They usually just go to jail. They don't get killed.
That happened with ex-Yugoslavia tribunal, for example. They were all to jail. The war in the Balkans. Went to jail.
likely, I don't think they would be conducting executions anymore.
Everybody has the number one right, universal right, is the right of your life. So it's, even for criminals, they have the right to leave. That's the most accepted theory, right? Some countries have the exception, like they have the death penalty, but most of the countries don't. So I think respecting that, executions wouldn't be like the punishment that a tribunal would consider first.
Plus, yeah, again, Yugoslavia as well as Saddam, they were committing crimes against humanity as well. So, war crimes, these things, yes, terrible, but they do not affect a whole population at large, every single individual. These are more individual cases, I would say. Makes sense? Whereas genocide affects everybody. So, yeah. That a genocide would not necessarily fall under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court.
If I have a non-privileged combatant, like under my control, right, like a mercenary or a child soldier, wouldn't that possibly make the laws like looser for me, where I could possibly do more? Like my soldiers could be quote unquote like doing more war crimes just because they're not officially my soldiers.
So, okay, mercenaries. Yes, they can do more, so to say. They are also not officially the forces of the state, right? So it gives states plausible deniability. They can always say, oh yeah, that guy just decided to do whatever, not because we instructed him. The mercenary would also be trialed according to the domestic law of the captor, civilian law. And they will be tried as combatants. A child will not be tried as a combatant. He will be tried as a civilian.
So wait, isn't it better for me as a country to like have child soldiers? Because then the laws don't apply as much and I have more soldiers.
To you as a country, no, it's not. Because a child soldier, like, there is a convention on mercenaries and child soldiers, exactly. So, paying children to go to war is a crime in itself. So.
Well, what if my country doesn't acknowledge them as children? What if my country says that a full-age person comes from like the 15-year-olds are already full-age person? Does that make them shit?
Okay.
Wait, so 16-year-olds could theoretically be already full-grown soldiers?
Yeah.
Okay, at least something.
What are your plans exactly?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask. Shipping your
I won't
plans.
talk about it.
I only want
Fair enough.
16-year-olds.
Sorry?
I only want in my army 16-year-olds.
Here you go. You're planning a lot of things.
You know, I don't want to know either, so.
Any other question?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you for coming.
That's it. Then that's it.
All right, thank you very much.